What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Today, we're chatting with Sean Woodley from Locked On Raptors to figure out why the Raptors have regressed so much from last season into this year. Fred VanVleet shooting his worst three-point percentage of his entire career in a contract year, no less. What happens with Fred VanVleet moving forward? Should the Raptors extend him? Should they let him hit free agency? Or should they explore trade options for Steady Freddy? And then have expectations been set a little bit too high for Scottie Barnes year 2? We're going to break down all of that for you. But first, today's episode is brought to you by Built Bar. Are you looking for a delicious treat, but you don't want all of that fat and calories, right? Then you've got to try Built Bar. Look, I've said it once, I'll say it again. Built Bar are the number one protein bars on the market. It's because every single bar is coated in 100% delicious chocolate. They're soft, they're easy to chew. They've got so many incredible flavors to choose from, like churro, peanut butter brownie, coconut almond, cookies and cream, salted caramel, strawberry, raspberry. I could just go on and on and on and on. My personal favorite is coconut brownie chunk, though. But you really can't go wrong with a single bar on their menu. Every single bar is low cal, low sugar, high protein, high fiber. Amazing if you're on a keto diet. Amazing if you're trying to cut back a little bit, really stick to those New Year's resolutions. You can check them out. Just go to built.com and use promo code LOCKEDON15 to get 15% off your very next order of the best tasting protein bars on the market. Again, that's promo code LOCKEDON15 for 15% off at built.com. Joining us now is Sean Woodley, the host of Locked On Raptors. You can find wherever you listen to your podcast and on YouTube. Just search Locked On Raptors. Sean, Let's try and understand. Let's try and get to the bottom of, maybe we won't be able to do this in just a quick segment here, but just help us understand a little bit more what's going on with this Raptors team. Because you look at them last season, right? 5th in the Eastern Conference, 48-34. They were 13th in defense, or I apologize, 15th in defense last year, or 15th in offense last year. I apologize. I'm all over the place. 9th in defense, and they've since kind of regressed a little bit from that. This year, they're 19th in offense, 13th in defensive rating, 17-23. 11th in the Eastern Conference. Let's start there. Like, what has been the reason for such significant regression for this Raptors team this season?
That's the really difficult thing to figure out, Jackson, because it's a lot of little things. I feel like there's no one big sort of boogeyman problem you can look at and say, hey, that's why the Raptors have disappointed. It's a lot of stuff coming together. You've had career worst shooting seasons from Fred VanVleet, Gary Trent Jr. up to this point, although he's really coming back to earth, OG Anunoby as well. And those three guys were like the only three guys on last year's Raptors team who were anything worth a damn from outside. You have them not really succeed or match their previous, 3-point output this season. And you combine that with a lack of internal growth from guys who they really hope to get shooting from. And so the offense, as a result, is just a mess. There's no space whatsoever. Pascal Siakam is spending half of his possessions diving into 4 dudes and kicking it out and hoping a guy's going to hit a 3 that's inevitably going to brick. That's been a big part of it. On defense, they seem lost. Nick Nurse's scheme is really complex. It demands a lot of guys, and it just seems like they've kind of lost the rope on it this year. Precious Achiuwa missed 24 games for the Raptors as well. He was a huge part of the great finish to last year the Raptors had in the second half. Precious was incredible, and the Raptors were really banking on that happening this year. He got hurt. He also hasn't been quite himself, and so that's led to problems. Really, where this all comes down to me, Jackson, is the front office saw a team win 48 games. It was really fun, super cool. And the idea was, all right, we're not going to do a ton in the offseason to fix what ain't broke here. We're just going to see if we can make a small addition or two. They bring in Otto Porter Jr. on the, I think a $6 million a year deal, the biannual exception. Perfectly fine deal to bring in. And they think, all right, you know what? We're going to go ahead and just see if we can get internal development to fill the holes that we have on the team, which are center play, ball handling, 3-point shooting. And none of those things have happened. And that has left the Raptors sitting here, a month before the trade deadline, still kind of, I think, unsure of their direction. because it seems pretty clear that the front office is kind of now in their boat to figure out how to fix this, but it's a question of, do you fix it? Is it worth fixing? Do you sort of retool things like that? It's left a whole bunch of questions, and I don't think they were expecting this much stagnation, even though I think the worst thing that happened to this team was winning 48 games last season and setting the bar for expectation way too high coming in.
I want to ask you about Fred VanVleet and maybe the ideal direction to go with him for this franchise. But sure. You mentioned that term internal development a couple times there. Do you maybe look at like Scottie Barnes? Like, what were the expectations for him in his sophomore year? And has he also maybe regressed a little bit, or just not taken like the jump that you would have maybe expected he would have taken for his sophomore stint?
I'd say the first couple months for sure there was some clear regression there. There was less aggression. There was less in terms of like mid-range pull-up jumpers, which were kind of this like amazing thing that fell from the sky into his repertoire last season that no one expected. And just like kind of just a general lack of, I think maybe not focus or whatever, but like consistent energy throughout 48 minutes of games. He does this thing. He's done it all season long. We're 3 quarters into the game. It's like, what's Scottie Barnes doing? He's got 6 points. He's taken 3 shots. What's going on? And then all of a sudden the fourth quarter comes around and he becomes an absolute monster. If you watch that just ridiculous game against the Bucks this week on Wednesday, where the Raptors score 28 points in the last 3 minutes to force overtime after trailing by 21, Scottie Barnes was the reason that happened. He scored like 9 buckets over Brook Lopez, the presumptive defensive player of the year, just because he felt like it. And so while there's been regression in the overall sort of night-to-night production from Scottie, I do think there's still plenty of reason for optimism because the peaks are so bloody high. And to his credit, he's really turned it around the last month or so. Defense was also a huge regression point for him. They were asking him to play on the wing, perimeter defense quite a bit to start the year. He just doesn't have the chops to stay in front of guys, where he's actually pretty good when he's just like around the rim being tall and getting in the way. And he's essentially become the Raptors' nominal go-to center the last few weeks here. And it's worked really well. He's had really strong performances, even as recently as today against Yusuf Nurkic on Sunday. Scottie Barnes is kind of turning it around here. It's maybe not to the level you would have hoped. It's not the clear step up from last year where he won Rookie of the Year, but these things aren't linear. They take time. The Raptors are kind of a weird team with all sorts of mouths to feed, and Scottie Barnes is finding his way now. But yeah, there's, I think, been a little bit of a drop back in what you would have hoped for. And, if you get all-star Scottie Barnes coming out here and he takes that type of leap, you're probably not talking about the Raptors struggling the way they have so far, but that might have never been a fair thing to ask for from a 21-year-old going into his second season.
Maybe setting the bar a little bit too high for Scottie there, but you mentioned there momentarily this most recent game for the Raptors, a win against the Blazers, their first win of 2023. In this game, talking about Fred VanVleet and just his struggle shooting the ball, right? At one point, the Blazers had cut this game to a 3-point lead, just after the Raptors led by as many as 19, cutting it to 3 in the fourth quarter, and Steady Freddy hits a pair of back-to-back threes, right? And he like looks up and he's like, "Thank God!" Like they finally, like they're starting to drop for a guy. How crazy is it for a guy right in his contract year to just have the regression that he's had, to be struggling shooting the ball the way he is? And when you look at just the decisions that need to be made here maybe as soon as a couple months out, not even about like, what do you even do with VanVleet? Do you consider, is the extension maybe still on the table? Do you consider letting him get to free agency? Is it possible to even entertain maybe trading him? Like, what is the direction that the franchise should be going with VanVleet?
It's really hard, and I think it comes down to what you make of VanVleet's struggles so far this season. There's essentially 2 schools of thought. One school of thought is, this guy's been one of the best 3-point shooters in the league for the last 6 years. He's been one of the best catch and shoot shooters, literally like of all time for long stretches of that time. And it's weird that he's falling off this year, but is this an outlier season? And if you think it's just an outlier and that positive regression to the mean is coming, and those 2 big crunch time threes against the Blazers, certainly a step in the right direction for Fred, because it feels like none of those shots have fallen all season long. If you think that's going to keep up and, that he's going to get back to being, maybe not an all-star level point guard, because there were certain contextual things that happened last year with Pascal Siakam missing the start of the year that led to Fred VanVleet having all-star numbers. But if he can just be a really nice complement to Pascal Siakam, Scottie Barnes, and OG Anunoby, the 3 sort of core pieces on this team, then there's a real argument for keeping him around. He's a ball handler, which the Raptors need. He's a shooter, which the Raptors need. And he can play the Raptors style of defense, which not a lot of guys can do, even though his foot speed on the defensive end, his staying in front of guys, has been a problem this year as well. That's where school number 2 comes in, which is Fred VanVleet's 5'11" generously. He is going to be 29 by the end of this season. Do you want to be in the business of paying Fred VanVleet's next contract? And that's a tricky thing. He's got an opt-out this summer. He's presumably going to take that because he's, going to, cash in on a not great free agency class and, set himself up with one last big contract, you would think. And it is a risk if the Raptors want to sort of lock themselves into this team with Fred VanVleet being their 4th option. I don't yet know where I come down on it. Honestly, it's a really hard thing to parse. The 3-point shooting, I feel like it's going to bounce back. The defense is what gives me a little bit of pause here. I'm sure the Raptors have way more internal data and stuff on where he is physically, what kind of decline we're seeing, if any at all. His other metrics, though, like he's getting to the rim just as much as he usually has. He's scoring around the rim with, he's not like he's never been an amazing at rim scorer, but he's not any appreciably worse than he's been, throughout his career on his averages. So it's hard to kind of figure out. I still think they're going to take a few weeks to decide here, but I do think if the Raptors season gets away from them here, there's a real chance Fred VanVleet gets traded at the deadline. He might be the only Raptor to get traded at the deadline, and that would be obviously a pretty big move for whatever team picks him up. He's a guy with championship experience, but it would also be a massive pivot for a Raptors team that has had Fred VanVleet as one of their faces for the last few seasons here.
Aside from kind of some of the individual struggles of certain guys this year, how much of the Raptors' struggles this season do you possibly attribute to Nick Nurse? And at this point, should he be on the hot seat based on kind of how the season's gone?
It's tough. If you ask some Raptors fans, they would say send him out to sea on a barge and never, talk to him again. I think if you ask more reasonable Raptors fans, they would say, yeah, it's not been a great Nick Nurse season. There has been stubbornness when it comes to sticking with his very complex and, high risk schemes. I get why he likes the way the Raptors play defense, which is very high octane. They scramble around. They send two to the ball routinely. They like to force turnovers. They like to make the defense sort of think and feel like they're seeing ghosts when they're taking open threes with big, long dudes contesting out to them. But it's a really hard thing to maintain, especially if you don't have the personnel for it. And Nick Nurse has not exactly been keen on simplifying things, getting more conservative at all. At the same time, I don't blame him because the Raptors offense stinks so bad that they kind of need those transition opportunities to keep their offense afloat. But then you ask, why does the offense stink so bad? There's not a whole lot of offensive ingenuity going on. It's a lot of, let's hunt the mismatch. Let's just kind of play, sort of by the skin of our pants and just figure it out on the fly. And that's just not enough structure, I think, for this team where like a few more set plays per night might actually create some better looks than they do kind of on their own. I still think Nick Nurse has plenty of rope. He's won a championship, and a really good barometer that a routine guest of mine on Locked On Raptors, our pal Jamar Hines from Raptors Republic, pointed out on my show last week was, if you let Nick Nurse go right now, how quickly do like 7 or 8 teams fire their coaches to try to hire Nick Nurse? Very quickly is the answer. He's a very good coach. He's a great tactician. And not only would you regret sort of letting him go and then seeing some other team scoop him up immediately, but also if you get to a playoff series, whether it's this year or next year, without Nick Nurse there to kind of pull the levers in a way that we know he's very good at. He's won a championship playing high school defenses against Steph Curry because it worked and he didn't care. He's really good as an in-game guy. To not have him once you get to the playoffs, whenever that is in the future, you might regret not having that guy around. And so I would guess he's got lots of rope. I think the front office also knows that there's plenty on them for the roster not being totally full of guys who can play his style. And so I think there's simpatico between the two, but the season progresses. If things don't change, if there's still this sort of stubbornness to changing up the schemes, I could see there being more calls for his head. But at the same time, why do we not give coaches the same room to improve and adapt that we do to players, right? That happens for players all the time. Nick Nurse has shown himself to be adaptable in the past. I'm guessing give him enough time with this roster, he'll figure out a way to milk wins out of it, because that's literally what he's done his entire career as a head coach.
How much future runway does Nick Nurse have with the Raptors? Can the Raptors get back on track this season? And what does the future hold for Fred VanVleet? Of course, you got us covered for all that and more over at Locked On Raptors. Sean, I appreciate you stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Anytime, man.